Hello and welcome back. Settle in tonight. Let the mattress take your weight. Let the day finally slide off your shoulders. Tonight's journey is a little different from some of the others we've taken together. Instead of one long thread, we're wandering through a whole quiet collection of small, strange objects, each one, at some point, genuinely startling the people who first found it. A hammer sealed inside solid rock. A clay jar wired like a battery. A 12-sided bronze puzzle with no known purpose at all. Some of tonight's mysteries have real, settled, genuinely satisfying answers, patiently worked out by careful researchers over the years. A few honestly don't. They remain open questions even now, and will sit with that uncertainty gently, rather than rushing to fill it with anything more dramatic than the truth actually allows. Either way, every single object tonight is real, sitting in a real museum or a real private collection somewhere. And every single explanation is the genuine, most current understanding, not simply the version that makes the best headline. You don't need to remember any of it. Let your eyes rest closed. Let your breathing slow in gently through the nose and out even more slowly. There's nothing to solve tonight, only a long, quiet drawer full of strange small objects, waiting patiently to be taken out one at a time and gently looked at again. Let's begin. In 1936, a couple named Max and Emma Hahn were walking along a dry creek bed near London, Texas, when they noticed an unusual lump of rock with a small piece of wood protruding from one side. They took it home simply as an interesting curiosity, and it sat there, largely forgotten, for roughly a decade before their son finally cracked the rock open in 1947, revealing a complete iron hammerhead still attached to its original wooden handle. The tool itself looked entirely ordinary, but the rock surrounding it appeared considerably older, eventually earning the object a considerably more dramatic nickname than a simple lost hammer probably deserved: the London artifact. Soon promoted by certain interested parties as proof that humans had somehow existed alongside dinosaurs. The real explanation, as we'll see, turns out to be almost as interesting as the myth. Just built from geology rather than mystery, the rock encasing the hammer is what geologists call a concretion, a hard mineral nodule that forms when dissolved minerals in groundwater gradually harden around some kind of central object, whether a shell, a pebble, or, apparently, a lost tool. Crucially, concretions like this one don't require millions of years to form at all. Under the right conditions, particularly in mineral-rich water. They can harden completely within just a few decades or centuries, a process well documented at many other sites around the world. The hammer's own style, meanwhile, is unmistakably that of a standard 19th century American mining or blacksmithing tool, and its handle shows no sign of the kind of mineral replacement that would occur over truly deep geological time. Put simply, someone likely dropped or lost this ordinary tool sometime in the 1800, and the surrounding rock simply grew up around it afterward, considerably faster than anyone unfamiliar with concretions would ever expect. The London hammer attracted relatively little attention for decades, until it was acquired in 1983 by Carl Baugh, a young Earth creationist who began promoting it as evidence that the accepted geological timescale must be wrong, since a modern-looking tool appeared to be embedded in rock supposedly hundreds of millions of years old. Independent geologists who have examined the case, including researcher Glenn Cuban, have consistently pointed to the same basic explanation: a relatively recent tool, encased by a relatively fast-forming concretion, with no verified evidence it was ever actually recovered from the ancient bedrock formation its promoters claim. Notably, the hammer's current owner has never allowed the wood or surrounding stone to undergo full, independent, formally published testing, leaving the case permanently just short of the kind of definitive analysis that could close it completely. Even so, every piece of evidence that has been gathered points in exactly the same ordinary, unmysterious direction. It's worth sitting for a moment with what actually makes the London hammer so quietly satisfying as a genuine mystery. Even once you know the likely explanation, it isn't really a story about deep time or ancient secrets at all. It's a story about how easily the natural world can create something that looks deliberately impossible, simply through slow, ordinary chemistry, doing exactly what chemistry does. A concretion doesn't know or care what it's protecting. It simply keeps building mineral layer by mineral layer around whatever happens to be sitting there when the water starts to work. Sometimes that's a fossil. Sometimes, apparently, it's a miner's dropped hammer. Either way, the rock itself was never lying. It was just doing what rocks patiently do, and it took a curious mind considerably longer to catch up with a considerably simpler truth in 1936, while excavating near the ancient city of Ctesiphon in present-day Iraq. Archaeologists uncovered a small clay jar containing a copper cylinder wrapped around an iron rod. The whole assembly sealed together with a plug of natural asphalt. The jar dated to somewhere within the Parthian or early Sassanian period, roughly 2,000 years ago, and its unusual internal arrangement immediately caught the attention of Vilhelm Koenig, then director of the National Museum of Iraq's laboratory. Koenig proposed something genuinely startling, that this ordinary-looking clay pot might actually function as a simple galvanic cell, essentially an ancient battery, capable of generating a small electrical charge. The idea spread quickly and has remained genuinely popular in the decades since, earning the object its now famous nickname, the Baghdad Battery. If you actually build a careful replica of the jar and fill it with a mild acid like vinegar or grape juice, it will, in fact, generate a small electrical current, typically less than a single volt, a modest but genuinely measurable amount. This appealing demonstration is part of why the battery theory has held on so persistently in popular imagination for nearly a century now. However, professional archaeologists studying the wider Parthian world have raised a genuinely serious objection. Nothing resembling an electroplated object, jewelry, or metalwork, bearing any trace of ancient electrochemical treatment, has ever been found anywhere from this same period. Despite electroplating being the theory's most commonly proposed practical use. If ancient craftsmen truly possessed working batteries, we would reasonably expect to find at least some of the gilded objects they supposedly used them to create. The considerably more widely accepted explanation among archaeologists today points to something far less dramatic, but far better supported by the surrounding evidence. The jars closely resemble other containers found at nearby sites, generally understood to have served as storage vessels for sacred scrolls, with the copper cylinder likely functioning as a protective, moisture-resistant sleeve for a rolled parchment or papyrus document, rather than as any kind of electrical component. Elizabeth Stone, a professor of Iraqi archaeology at Stony Brook University, who led the first archaeological expedition back into Iraq after 2 decades of restricted access, has noted plainly that she doesn't know a single working archaeologist in the field who genuinely accepts the battery interpretation. It's a useful reminder that a clever, replicable demonstration doesn't automatically prove historical intent. Sometimes an object simply happens to be capable of doing something interesting entirely by coincidence, well, after the fact, there's something worth appreciating in the Baghdad Battery story, beyond simply settling which explanation is correct. Ancient Parthian society clearly valued its sacred texts enough to develop a specific, considered method for protecting them from Mesopotamia's humid, deteriorating climate, using materials, copper, iron, and bitumen, chosen specifically for their genuinely useful preservative properties. That's a real, if less flashy, form of ancient ingenuity in its own right. Not electrical engineering, but careful, patient material science applied to the equally important ancient problem of simply keeping an important document readable for as long as possible. Sometimes the truth behind a mystery object turns out to be a quieter kind of cleverness than the myth promised, but genuine cleverness all the same. On February 13th, 1961, 3 rock hunters named Wallace Lane, Mike Hussell, and Virginia Maxey were prospecting for geodes in California's Coso Mountains, gathering mineral samples to sell in their small gift shop, when Mike Hussell cut open what looked like an ordinary hardened nodule and found something considerably stranger inside. A cylindrical object with a clearly metallic core, surrounded by what appeared to be a ceramic casing and small hexagonal components. Excited by the unusual find, the trio speculated it might be extremely ancient, and word eventually reached a magazine called Info, dedicated to unexplained phenomena, which published X-ray images and a considerably more sensational interpretation in 1969. The resulting story proposed the object might be genuinely prehistoric, encased within a geode potentially hundreds of thousands of years old, sparking real, widespread fascination that has continued for decades since. Closer examination of the X-ray images, along with the object's actual visible components, revealed something considerably more mundane than an ancient mystery. The internal structure was consistent with a spark plug of a specific, identifiable type manufactured in the 1920s, complete with recognizable porcelain insulation and a metal core matching designs commonly used in Ford Model T and Model A engines. In 1999, researchers Pierre Stromberg and geologist Paul Heinrich obtained the original X-ray photographs and shared them with additional experts who confirmed the object was almost certainly a champion spark plug, the exact type widely used throughout mining operations that were genuinely active in the Koso Range during that same period. The surrounding geode, meanwhile, was almost certainly a much more ordinary hardened mineral concretion, formed relatively quickly around a piece of discarded mining equipment, rather than anything requiring anywhere near geological timescales. Unlike several other objects we'll encounter tonight, the actual Koso artifact itself has, unfortunately, been lost. Its current whereabouts genuinely unknown, meaning no further direct physical examination has been possible since those original X-rays were taken decades ago. This leaves the case in a slightly unusual position compared to the Antikythera mechanism, a genuinely ancient device we've explored on another night, which remains carefully preserved and available for repeated, increasingly sophisticated scientific study. Without the original object in hand, researchers must rely entirely on the existing photographs and written accounts from 1969, which, while reasonably convincing, can never quite offer the same absolute certainty that direct physical testing would provide. Even so, every piece of available evidence, the visible ceramic insulator, the hexagonal fitting, and the specific mining history of the region, points toward the same ordinary conclusion: a lost spark plug, rather than anything requiring an extraordinary rewrite of the historical record. It's worth noticing a pattern quietly repeating itself across tonight's first three objects: a hammer, a battery, and a spark plug, each one perfectly ordinary on its own, each one made genuinely mysterious only by the unusual, unexpected material found surrounding it. None of these objects were secretly ancient, after all. What was genuinely old in each case was simply the rock or mineral deposit that happened to form around something considerably more recent. An entirely natural process operating on its own patient timeline, with absolutely no regard for how confusing the resulting combination might eventually look to someone unfamiliar with basic geology. Sometimes the real mystery isn't the object at all, but simply how easily two unrelated timelines, a lost tool and a slow mineral process, can end up looking, at first glance, like a single impossible one. The very term we've been quietly using tonight, an out-of-place artifact, or OOP art for short, was actually coined by naturalist and cryptozoologist Ivan T. Sanderson sometime in the mid-20th century, originally intended as a fairly neutral, descriptive label for any object that seemed to challenge the accepted historical or geological timeline. Over the following decades, the term gradually became closely associated with a considerably more sensational genre of speculation, often implying lost advanced civilizations, extraterrestrial visitors, or deliberately suppressed archaeological evidence. It's worth holding onto the term's original, more modest meaning tonight, since nearly every object we're wandering through really did seem genuinely out of place to the people who first encountered it, right up until careful, patient investigation quietly put each one back exactly where it belonged. In November of 1898, a Swedish immigrant farmer named Olof Uarman reported finding a large slab of stone entangled in the roots of a tree on his property near Kensington, Minnesota. Covered in runic characters describing a group of Scandinavian explorers supposedly traveling through the region in the year 1362. If genuine, the stone would represent remarkable evidence of Norse exploration deep into the American interior, more than a century before Columbus. And the discovery caused genuine, widespread excitement among Scandinavian American communities eager for a documented connection to this same celebrated history. The stone was examined by numerous experts over the following decades, sparking one of American archaeology's longest-running authenticity debates. The eventual, carefully researched verdict, however, would prove considerably less romantic than the story it told. Beginning with the very first formal linguistic examination in 1910, and repeatedly confirmed through more recent geological analysis, the overwhelming scholarly consensus holds that the Kensington runestone is a 19th century creation rather than a genuine medieval artifact. The language used in its inscription contains grammatical forms and specific vocabulary that simply didn't exist in 14th century Scandinavian dialects, instead closely matching Swedish as it was actually spoken and written in the late 1800. Detailed geological study published in recent years found the stone's carved surfaces showed minimal weathering, entirely inconsistent with 5 centuries of burial and exposure, while its distinctive coating more closely resembled artificially applied stucco than any naturally accumulated mineral deposit. Rather than a genuine Norse record, most researchers now believe it was likely carved by Uarman himself or someone in his immediate community sometimes shortly before its convenient discovery. Perhaps the most genuinely persuasive demonstration against the Kensington runestone's authenticity came, almost accidentally, from a group of graduate students decades later. In the late 1980s, students studying Germanic philology, fascinated by the ongoing controversy, quietly carved their own runic inscription onto a large boulder near the original discovery site, deliberately mimicking the same style and approach, purely out of curiosity about whether people might find it similarly convincing. Their experiment, later revealed through a formal signed affidavit, demonstrated firsthand just how plausible a carefully researched modern forgery could genuinely appear to an untrained eye. It's a fittingly honest footnote to an already complicated case. Sometimes the clearest proof that something can be faked convincingly is watching a group of curious students successfully do it themselves, purely to see if they could. Beginning in the 1960s, a Peruvian physician named Javier Cabrera d'Archaeology began collecting thousands of engraved stones near the town of Ica, Peru, each one carved with detailed images depicting what appeared to be advanced surgical procedures, sophisticated astronomical instruments, and most strikingly, humans apparently interacting closely with dinosaurs. Cabrera believed these stones represented genuine evidence of an ancient, technologically advanced civilization possessing knowledge that predated, and in some ways surpassed, our own modern understanding. He eventually amassed a collection numbering in the thousands, displaying them in a dedicated private museum, and publishing his theories in considerable detail, convinced he had uncovered one of archaeology's most significant suppressed discoveries. The stone's true origin became considerably clearer once local farmers, who had been selling the carved rocks directly to Cabrera for a steady, welcome supplement to their income, eventually admitted to fabricating them themselves, carving fresh designs based partly on illustrations from contemporary comic books, magazines, and textbooks readily available in the local area. One farmer, Basilio Ushuya, publicly demonstrated the carving technique for journalists, even reproducing dinosaur imagery clearly modeled on illustrations from popular books, rather than any genuine ancient artistic tradition. Despite these direct confessions, Cabrera himself refused to accept the explanation for the rest of his life, insisting the farmers were simply covering for the stone's true, more remarkable origin. It stands as a genuinely poignant example of how deeply a believer's initial excitement can end up outlasting even the most direct, first-hand evidence to the contrary. Crystal skulls represent another genuinely fascinating case of mistaken ancient attribution, with numerous polished quartz skulls, some housed for decades in major museum collections, long promoted as pre-Columbian Aztec or Mayan artifacts possessing mysterious properties. The most famous example, known as the Mitchell Hedges skull, was long claimed to have been discovered at a Maya ruin in Belize during a 1920s expedition. Its supposedly impossible craftsmanship, cited as evidence of lost ancient technology or even paranormal energy. Detailed examination using modern electron microscopy, however, revealed tool marks on several prominent crystal skulls, entirely consistent with rotary lapidary equipment, wheel-cutting tools that simply didn't exist anywhere in the pre-Columbian Americas, but were readily available to European craftsmen throughout the 19th century. Following this same rotary tool evidence, alongside inconsistent and often contradictory accounts of their original discovery, most major museums holding crystal skulls, including the British Museum and the Smithsonian, have since formally reclassified their examples as 19th century European creations, most likely manufactured in Germany, specifically to be sold to collectors eager for exotic, ancient-looking curiosities. The Mitchell Hedges skull's own dramatic discovery story has similarly failed to hold up, with its documented ownership history first appearing in written records only after its supposed original discoverer purchased it at a London auction in 1943. It's a genuinely useful lesson to carry forward from tonight's collection. Sometimes an object's mystery comes not from where it actually originated, but from a genuinely compelling story told convincingly enough and long enough, eventually becoming more famous than the truth it was quietly covering over. Not every object in tonight's collection has a tidy, settled explanation, and it's worth sitting honestly with one that genuinely doesn't. Since the first example was discovered in the Netherlands in 1739, over 100 small, hollow bronze objects shaped as regular 12-sided solids, each face a pentagon with a circular hole cut through its center, have been recovered from Roman-era sites scattered across Britain, France, Germany, Switzerland, Hungary, and beyond. Dating to roughly the 2nd through 4th centuries CE. These objects are consistently well made, ranging from about an inch and a half to 4 inches across. Yet not a single ancient Roman text, inscription, or artistic depiction mentions them at all. Genuinely, honestly, nobody currently knows what they were for. Researchers have proposed a genuinely wide range of possible functions over the years. A candlestick holder, since a few examples show trace wax residue, though many dodecahedra are shaped in ways that would make balancing a candle genuinely impractical. Others have suggested a surveying or range-finding instrument, a device for calculating the optimal planting date for winter grain based on measuring sunlight through the variously sized holes, a decorative scepter ornament, a gaming die, or simply a symbolic religious object without any practical function at all. A recent, genuinely popular theory proposes the objects were used as a specialized tool for knitting gloves, with the different sized holes helping to form individual finger widths, an idea supported by hands-on experimental reconstruction, though it remains just one contender among many, rather than a settled answer. One particularly interesting clue comes from a 1966 discovery in Germany, where a dodecahedron was found in a woman's grave, positioned directly beside a separate rod-shaped bone object, suggesting the two may have been fitted together to form some kind of ceremonial staff or scepter. Researcher Michael Guggenberger, studying the wider pattern of dodecahedra discoveries, has proposed the objects may have functioned as a broadly symbolic, almost amulet-like item representing cosmic or religious order, rather than serving any single practical purpose at all. Notably, these objects appear exclusively within the empire's northern and western provinces, never within Italy or the Mediterranean core, hinting they may reflect a distinctly regional, possibly Gallo-Celtic tradition, rather than a universally understood Roman tool. In the summer of 2023, a volunteer with a local history group in Lincolnshire, England, unearthed yet another beautifully preserved dodecahedron, prompting renewed public and scholarly interest in a puzzle that has now genuinely persisted for well over 2.5 centuries. Richard Parker, the group's secretary, described the discovery as the find of a lifetime, while acknowledging honestly that the mystery remains exactly that, a mystery despite the wider public's evident hunger for a tidy, confirmed answer. There's something genuinely refreshing about ending this particular thread without a neat resolution. Not every ancient puzzle needs solving to remain worth our patient, genuine curiosity. Some are simply worth quietly sitting with, exactly as unresolved as the Romans themselves apparently left them. Standing within Delhi's Khao-Otub complex is a solid iron pillar over 23 feet tall, weighing more than 6 tons, cast sometime around 400 CE during the reign of the Gupta king Chandragupta II, whose name appears in a Sanskrit inscription carved directly into its surface. What makes the pillar genuinely remarkable isn't any mysterious origin at all, but a real, well-documented, and thoroughly explained achievement. Despite standing exposed to Delhi's humid monsoons and dry heat for over 16 centuries, the pillar has developed only the barest trace of surface rust and corrosion resistance that would be considered impressive even by many modern engineering standards. Careful metallurgical analysis has revealed the pillar's genuine secret, and it involves neither aliens nor lost technology, but real, sophisticated ancient chemistry. The iron used contains an unusually high concentration of phosphorus, a natural byproduct of the specific ore and smelting process ancient Indian ironworkers used, which reacts over time with moisture and oxygen to form a thin, remarkably stable protective layer called misoite, effectively sealing the metal's surface against further corrosion. Modern industrial steel typically contains far less phosphorus, deliberately, since excess phosphorus can otherwise make steel brittle, meaning today's engineers generally avoid the very compositional quirk that happened to make this particular ancient iron so durable in the specific conditions of Delhi's climate. Rather than representing some impossible, unexplainable ancient mystery, the Delhi iron pillar stands as one of the finest genuine confirmed examples of ancient engineering skill anywhere in the world, requiring real technical mastery to smelt, forge, and cast iron of this exceptional size and purity using furnace technology available in 4th century India. Similar corrosion-resistant iron objects have been documented at several other Indian sites, confirming this wasn't a single lucky accident, but a genuine, deliberately refined regional metallurgical tradition. It's worth appreciating the difference this makes to how we understand the object, not a mystery requiring an exotic explanation, but a genuine, well-earned point of pride in ancient Indian craftsmanship, fully explicable through patient modern chemistry, and all the more impressive for actually being real. there's a fitting lesson hiding within the iron pillar's story that's worth carrying forward into the rest of tonight's collection. Sometimes the most satisfying response to an apparently impossible ancient object isn't to explain it away as a hoax or a natural accident at all, but simply to properly understand the real, considerable skill that actually produced it. The pillar didn't need to be secretly modern or secretly alien to be worth marveling at. It only needed patient, curious metallurgists willing to ask the right chemical questions, and ancient craftsmen, many centuries earlier, who had already patiently worked out the right chemical answers entirely on their own. Carved into the walls of the Hathor Temple at Dendera in Egypt is a striking relief depicting an elongated, bulb-shaped object with a snake coiled inside it, resting atop what looks like a stylized lotus flower, connected to a nearby pillar shaped somewhat like a modern electrical support. To modern eyes encountering the image for the first time, it can look genuinely, strikingly similar to an electric light bulb, complete with a glowing filament, prompting real speculation over the decades that ancient Egyptians may have possessed some form of early electrical lighting technology. The image has become one of the more visually persuasive entries in popular ancient technology discussions, largely because the resemblance, at a glance, really is genuinely uncanny. Egyptologists who study the temple's full surrounding context read the same image considerably differently, and with good textual support. The relief depicts a well-documented mythological scene, a lotus flower giving rise to a snake, itself a common and recurring symbol within Egyptian religious art, representing creation, transformation, and the primordial waters from which the world was believed to have originally emerged. The nearby electrical pillar is understood as a jed pillar, a genuinely common Egyptian symbol representing stability, closely associated with the god Osiris, appearing in countless other unrelated temple contexts with no plausible electrical connection whatsoever. Nowhere in the extensive surviving Egyptian textual record, including thousands of preserved religious and administrative documents, is there any reference to electrical lighting, generating equipment, or the specialized vocabulary that would necessarily accompany such technology. The Dendera light offers a genuinely useful lesson in a phenomenon called pareidolia, our brain's very natural tendency to recognize familiar patterns, particularly faces and everyday objects with an essentially unrelated visual information. It's the same basic mental habit responsible for seeing a face in an electrical outlet or a cloud shaped like an animal applied here to an admittedly striking piece of ancient religious symbolism that happens to visually resemble modern lighting technology purely by coincidence. Once you know the full mythological context, the lotus and serpent motif appearing throughout the rest of the same temple, the resemblance to a light bulb becomes considerably harder to unsee as anything other than coincidence. Sometimes the most convincing, impossible ancient image is simply a very ordinary, very well-documented piece of symbolism, wearing an entirely unintended modern disguise. Since the 1970s, miners working deposits of pyrophyllite, a soft mineral near Oostdal, South Africa, have periodically recovered small, remarkably rounded objects, sometimes marked with subtle parallel grooves circling their surface, that have been dated by their surrounding rock layer to roughly 3 billion years old. Their unusual, near-perfect symmetry led some enthusiasts to propose these so-called Klerksdorp spheres must be deliberately manufactured objects, impossibly ancient evidence of some kind of intelligent activity long before life, as we understand it should have existed at all on Earth. The claim has circulated persistently in popular ancient mystery media for decades, often accompanied by dramatic photographs emphasizing the object's strikingly regular shape. Geologists who have studied the spheres directly offer a considerably less dramatic and considerably better supported explanation. The objects are a well-documented type of natural mineral concretion called a wollastonite or hematite nodule, formed through an entirely ordinary geological process in which mineral crystals grow outward in all directions from a central point, naturally producing a roughly spherical shape without any external deliberate shaping required at all. Their subtle surface grooves, meanwhile, correspond to natural crystal growth striations, a common feature of many mineral formations, rather than any deliberately engraved decoration. Similar naturally rounded concretions have been documented at mineral deposits across the world, from Moqui marbles in Utah to various iron nodules found throughout Europe, none of which require anything beyond ordinary, patient 3 billion year old chemistry to fully explain. Since the late 1960s, a persistent story has circulated describing a set of granite discs supposedly discovered in caves along the China-Tibet border, each one reportedly engraved with tiny hieroglyphic-style markings and said to depict evidence of an ancient crashed spacecraft and its alien occupants, nicknamed the Dropa people. Unlike every other object we've encountered tonight, however, no verified photograph, museum record, or independent physical examination of any actual Dropa stone has ever been produced by anyone claiming to have studied one directly. The entire story appears to trace back to a single, unverifiable magazine account, with each subsequent retelling adding further dramatic detail without ever producing the one thing that would settle the matter immediately: the actual physical object itself. Researchers who have carefully traced the Dropa stone story back through its publication history generally conclude the tale most likely originated as an entirely fictional piece, quite possibly intended from the very beginning as an imaginative short story, rather than a genuine reported discovery, which was then gradually retold and reframed as documented fact across successive retellings in increasingly sensational publications. It stands as a genuinely useful category to hold apart from tonight's other objects, not a misidentified real artifact, and not even a proven hoax built around a real object, but something closer to an urban legend that simply never had a verifiable physical object behind it in the first place. Sometimes the most important question to ask about a mysterious artifact isn't what it actually is, but whether anyone can actually produce it at all. In 1957, an amateur archaeologist excavating a Native American site in Brooklyn, Maine, recovered a small silver coin that was later identified as genuine Norse currency, minted during the reign of Norwegian King Olaf Kyrre, sometime between 1067 and 1093 CE. Unlike several objects we've already encountered tonight, the coin itself is entirely authentic, a real medieval Norse penny, not a modern forgery or a natural formation mistaken for something else. The genuinely open question isn't whether the coin is real, but rather how it actually ended up at a Native American settlement in Maine, several hundred miles south of the confirmed Norse settlement at L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland. The site where the coin was discovered contained substantial evidence of a long-established indigenous trading network, with artifacts recovered from across an enormous geographic range, suggesting the location functioned as a significant hub for extensive intertribal trade routes stretching across much of northeastern North America. Most archaeologists studying the case now believe the coin likely reached Maine exactly the way so many other trade goods did, passed gradually from hand to hand along established indigenous trade networks, possibly beginning with a genuine, but otherwise undocumented Norse contact somewhere further north, rather than direct Norse presence at the main site itself. A minority of researchers have raised concerns about the coin's specific excavation context and chain of custody, since it was recovered by a private collector rather than a professional archaeological team working under careful, controlled conditions. The Maine penny offers a genuinely useful contrast to several other objects tonight, since here the core physical evidence isn't actually in serious dispute at all. The coin is authentically medieval Norse. What remains genuinely open is a question of historical interpretation rather than authenticity. Exactly how a single, small, valuable object traveled such a considerable distance, and through how many intermediate hands before ending up buried at this particular site. It's a useful reminder that not every out-of-place object requires either a hoax or a natural coincidence to explain it. Sometimes a perfectly genuine object simply traveled further, and by a route considerably harder to trace than its final resting place might initially suggest. In China's remote Qinghai province, a mountain sometimes called Baiyigong contains several unusual pipe-like formations embedded within the surrounding rock, running through caves and extending toward a nearby salt lake. Their strikingly regular, tube-like structure led to considerable speculation, particularly following a brief 2002 Xinhua News report that the pipes might represent evidence of some kind of ancient, technologically advanced construction, perhaps even related to alien visitation. Subsequent, more careful geological and chemical analysis conducted by Chinese researchers found the pipes are composed primarily of iron oxide, consistent with natural mineral deposits that form when iron-rich groundwater flows through cracks and channels in certain types of sedimentary rock, gradually depositing solid material along the path of flow. This same natural process, sometimes producing genuinely striking, almost engineered-looking tube formations, has been documented at numerous other sites around the world, entirely unconnected to any human activity whatsoever, ancient or otherwise. Chinese scientists who studied the Bye Gong pipes directly found no evidence of any tool marks, deliberate shaping, or manufactured material, concluding the formations were the straightforward product of a well-understood natural mineral process playing out over a very long stretch of geological time. It's a pattern we've now seen several times across tonight's collection. Nature, left to its own patient devices, is fully capable of producing shapes regular enough to look deliberately engineered to an eye simply unfamiliar with exactly how patient and precise ordinary geology can actually be. Not every object in tonight's collection turns out to be a hoax, a natural formation, or a simple misunderstanding. Some genuinely were exactly as impressive as they first appeared, once properly understood. Housed today in the British Museum, the Lycaeus cup is a Roman glass vessel dating to around the 4th century CE, depicting a mythological scene in intricate carved relief. What makes it genuinely remarkable isn't its carving alone, but a startling optical property researchers didn't fully understand until relatively recently. The cup appears a cloudy jade green when lit from the front, but glows a deep, glowing red when lit from behind, an effect no ordinary colored glass of any era should be capable of producing. In 1990, researchers using electron microscopy finally identified the cup's genuine secret, and it turns out to be real, deliberate, ancient nanotechnology, hundreds of years before anyone had a word for the concept. The glass contains tiny particles of silver and gold, deliberately ground down to an almost unbelievably small size, roughly 50 nanometers across, dispersed evenly throughout the glass itself. At this specific microscopic scale, the metal particles interact with light in a genuinely unusual way, called plasmonic resonance, absorbing and scattering different wavelengths, depending on whether light passes through the glass or reflects off its surface, producing the vessel's remarkable color-shifting effect. Modern scientists still aren't entirely certain how Roman glassmakers achieved this level of nanoscale precision, using only the metalworking and glassmaking tools available to them at the time, though it likely involved carefully controlled heating and grinding of precious metal alloys mixed directly into molten glass. Whatever their exact process, ancient Roman craftsmen were clearly working with genuine optical properties at a scale invisible to the naked eye, deliberately harnessing an effect modern nanotechnology only properly explained some 16 centuries later. It's a fitting entry for tonight's collection, precisely because it needs no myth or exaggeration at all. The real, confirmed, scientifically verified truth is already remarkable enough entirely on its own. Similarly genuine and similarly remarkable is the story of Damascus steel, a distinctively patterned type of blade prized throughout the medieval world for its unusual combination of flexibility, sharpness, and visible wavy surface markings, produced using a specific ingot of imported steel called woots, originally smelted in India and Sri Lanka before being forged into finished blades, primarily in the Middle East. The technique for producing genuine woot steel was gradually lost sometime around the 18th century, as the specific ore sources and smelting traditions that made it possible fell out of use, leaving modern metallurgists puzzling for generations over exactly what made original Damascus blades so genuinely exceptional. In 2006, a team of German researchers using electron microscopy discovered something genuinely remarkable embedded within the structure of a well-preserved 17th century Damascus blade. Carbon nanotubes, an incredibly fine cylindrical carbon structure that modern materials science didn't even formally identify and name until 1991. Researchers believe these nanotube structures likely formed as a natural byproduct of the specific smelting process and unique trace mineral impurities present in the original Wootz ore, rather than anything the original smiths could have deliberately engineered with any conscious understanding of nanoscale chemistry. It's a genuinely wonderful thought to sit with tonight, ancient craftsmen, working entirely through patient trial, error, and generations of inherited practical skill, stumbled onto a nanoscale material structure so effective that it would take the modern world nearly 3 centuries to even rediscover, let alone fully explain. Housed today at Yale University's Beinecke Rare Book Library, the Voynich Manuscript is a roughly 240-page handwritten book filled with elaborate illustrations of unfamiliar plants, astronomical diagrams, and small figures bathing in strange interconnected pools, all accompanied by continuous text written in a completely unknown script that has never been successfully translated by anyone. Radiocarbon dating conducted in 2009 confirmed the manuscript's vellum pages genuinely date to between 1404 and 1438, firmly placing its creation in early 15th century Europe, ruling out any possibility that it's a considerably more modern forgery. The book takes its name from Wilfrid Voynich, a Polish book dealer who acquired it in 1912 and first brought it to wider scholarly attention since the manuscript's rediscovery. Professional cryptographers, linguists, and even dedicated amateur codebreakers have spent well over a century attempting to decipher its unknown script, including some of the same code-breaking specialists responsible for cracking genuinely difficult military ciphers during both world wars. Despite occasional, periodically publicized claims of a breakthrough, none have withstood serious, sustained scholarly scrutiny, and the manuscript's text remains, to this day, genuinely and completely unread by anyone. Statistical analysis of the writing does show consistent internal patterns resembling a genuine language rather than random gibberish, suggesting it likely isn't simply meaningless scribble, though this still leaves an enormous range of open possibilities: an unknown natural language, a sophisticated cipher, an invented constructed language, or some combination of all three. Leading theories about the manuscript's actual content include a lost or invented language, an elaborate medical or herbal reference text using deliberately coded terminology to protect valuable proprietary knowledge, or even, according to one seriously considered proposal, an elaborate hoax created specifically to be sold to a wealthy, curious buyer, since manuscripts claiming secret or magical knowledge could command genuinely high prices throughout the medieval and early modern book trade. Unlike the Antikythera mechanisms, own long but ultimately successful decoding story, which we followed on another night, the Voynich Manuscript remains a case where dedicated, patient scholarship has genuinely, honestly not yet found its way to an answer, despite well over a century of committed effort by some of the most skilled codebreakers in modern history. There's something genuinely worth sitting within the Voynich manuscript's continued, honest mystery, especially after so many other objects tonight turned out to have solid, satisfying explanations once properly investigated. Not every genuine puzzle yields to patient effort within a reasonable human time frame, and the manuscript stands as a valuable reminder that real, unresolved mystery still exists comfortably alongside careful, rigorous scholarship, rather than only in the realm of hasty speculation. Somewhere in that unreadable script, a real person, roughly 600 years ago, was trying to communicate something specific and considered to someone else. We simply don't yet know what. And unlike so much of tonight's collection, that particular gap in our knowledge remains an entirely honest one. In 1885, workers at an iron foundry in Wolfsegg, Austria, reportedly discovered a strange, roughly cubical metal block embedded within a large chunk of coal, immediately sparking speculation that the object, subsequently nicknamed the Salzburg Cube, might represent an impossibly ancient manufactured artifact, since the surrounding coal was believed to have formed tens of millions of years before humans existed. Closer, more careful examination revealed the object isn't actually a perfect cube at all, but a somewhat irregular, naturally occurring iron and nickel meteorite fragment. Its rounded, weathered edges, consistent with natural erosion rather than deliberate manufacture. Its documented discovery circumstances, meanwhile, were never independently verified at the time, and it may simply have been an ordinary piece of mining equipment or meteoric debris that became accidentally associated with the coal seam sometime after the coal itself had already formed. The object itself has, notably, since gone missing from its original museum collection, leaving modern researchers working entirely from historical photographs and written descriptions rather than the physical object. Looking back across everything we've wandered through so far tonight, it's worth naming the quiet psychological pattern that connects nearly every object in this collection, whether the eventual explanation turned out to be a hoax, a natural formation, or a genuine, confirmed marvel. Human minds are remarkably good at recognizing patterns, sometimes almost too good, readily seeing deliberate design, intention, and meaning in places where simple chance, ordinary chemistry, or an entirely unrelated coincidence was actually responsible. This tendency, called pareidoachlia when applied to shapes, and apophenia more broadly when applied to any pattern, isn't a flaw exactly. It's the very same basic cognitive skill that lets us recognize a friend's face across a crowded room, or predict where a thrown ball will land. It simply, occasionally, fires a little too enthusiastically when pointed at an unusually shaped rock or an oddly regular mineral formation. It's also worth acknowledging honestly why stories like tonight's tend to spread so persistently, often considerably faster and further than their eventual, careful correction ever manages to travel. A dramatic claim, ancient batteries, impossible technology, evidence of aliens, is simply more immediately exciting to share than a patient geological explanation involving concretion formation rates or trace phosphorus content. This isn't a new problem created by the internet or social media. Exactly, since Ignatius Donnelly's own wildly popular Atlantis book found an eager audience well over a century before anyone had ever heard the word algorithm. It does mean, though, that each new generation of media, whether 19th century books or 21st century video platforms, tends to give exciting misinformation a genuine head start over its own more careful correction. Between 1924 and 1930, a series of lead crosses, swords, and spearheads bearing Latin inscriptions were reportedly uncovered near Tucson, Arizona, describing an supposed medieval Roman colony that had, according to the inscribed text, existed in the American Southwest centuries before Columbus. The objects generated genuine excitement and were even displayed for years at the University of Arizona, promoted as remarkable evidence of ancient transatlantic contact. Closer scholarly examination, however, identified serious linguistic inconsistencies in the supposed Latin, along with metallurgical analysis suggesting the lead itself had been cast using modern industrial techniques. Most historians now consider the Tucson artifacts an elaborate hoax, likely created by a local resident with some knowledge of Latin, specifically to fool the university's own eager investigators. In 1866, miners working a gold mine near Calaveras County, California, reportedly recovered a human skull embedded deep within volcanic rock they believed to be several million years old, immediately hailed by some in the scientific community as remarkable evidence of a genuinely ancient human presence in North America, published enthusiastically by a state geologist eager for exactly this kind of dramatic confirmation. Later investigation revealed the skull was very likely a deliberate practical joke played by local miners on the state geologist, who had reportedly made himself somewhat unpopular in the area with an ordinary, considerably more recent skull planted specifically to embarrass him. It stands as a useful, humbling reminder that scientific eagerness for a dramatic discovery can occasionally make even trained professionals more vulnerable to a well-timed prank than they might otherwise like to admit. In 1889, workers digging a well near Nampa, Idaho, reported bringing up a small, crudely shaped clay figurine from deep underground at a depth that seemed to place it within sediment layers believed to be several 100,000 years old, sparking real speculation about an impossibly ancient human presence in North America. Later investigation raised serious doubts about the object's actual origin and depth of recovery, since the drilling method used could easily have introduced surface material to considerable depths accidentally, and the figurine's style closely resembled ordinary contemporary folk art rather than anything distinctly ancient. Most researchers today consider the Nampa figurine either an accidental modern contamination of the drilling site or possibly a deliberate hoax, rather than genuine evidence of deep human antiquity in the region. It's worth pausing to notice that tonight's collection actually sorts fairly neatly into three quite different categories, each requiring its own particular kind of careful investigation. Some objects, like the Kensington runestone or the Iika stones, turn out to be deliberate hoaxes created by real people for reasons ranging from simple mischief to genuine profit. Others, like the London hammer or the Klerksdorp spheres, are entirely genuine natural objects, simply misunderstood by people unfamiliar with the specific, patient geological processes actually responsible for their unusual appearance. And a smaller few, like the Roman dodecahedra or the Voynich Manuscript, are completely genuine, thoroughly authentic artifacts whose actual original purpose or meaning simply hasn't been successfully recovered yet honestly by anyone. Recognizing which of these three categories a particular claim actually falls into turns out to be one of the most useful habits of mind anyone can bring to this entire genre of ancient mystery. A hoax requires finding the hoaxer, or at least identifying the telltale signs of deliberate, recent fabrication. A natural formation requires understanding the specific, patient geological or chemical process actually responsible, and a genuine unsolved mystery requires the honesty to simply say clearly and without embarrassment that we don't yet know, rather than filling that gap with whatever explanation happens to feel most satisfying in the moment. All three outcomes are perfectly legitimate answers, The only genuinely unhelpful response is assuming, right from the very start, that the explanation must automatically be the most dramatic one available. Some objects manage to move between these three categories over time as investigation slowly, patiently improves. The Antikythera mechanism, a sophisticated ancient Greek-geared device we've explored in considerable detail on another night, spent decades sitting in something close to the genuine unsolved mystery category, dismissed by many early researchers as too advanced to be properly ancient at all. Before patient scientific work eventually moved it firmly into the genuine, confirmed, remarkable artifact category instead. It's a useful reminder that tonight's own neat categories aren't necessarily permanent. An object can begin its story looking like an impossible mystery and end it, after considerable patient work, as a fully understood and often even more impressive, confirmed piece of genuine ancient ingenuity. Taking stock of everything we've wandered through across tonight's collection so far: hammers and batteries, hoaxed stones and confirmed nanotechnology, natural minerals mistaken for ancient engineering, and at least one genuinely open question nobody has yet managed to close. A clear pattern has quietly emerged. The ancient and not so ancient past is considerably stranger and considerably more varied than any single explanation could possibly cover. Some objects genuinely were exactly as remarkable as they first appeared. Others simply needed patient, careful investigation to reveal a rather more ordinary, though often no less interesting, truth underneath. Created in 1513 by Ottoman Admiral Piri Reis, a surviving fragment of an old world map has occasionally been cited as evidence of impossibly advanced ancient cartography, since its southern coastline has sometimes been interpreted as an accurate depiction of Antarctica. Centuries before that continent was officially discovered by Western explorers, and long before its ice-covered coastline could have been mapped in any detail at all. Piri Reis himself included a note directly on the map explaining he had compiled it from a considerable number of older source charts, some reportedly dating back to the era of Alexander the Great, blending genuine exploration-era knowledge with inherited older material, and in places, honest speculation and error. Cartographic historians who have studied the map's actual southern coastline in careful detail generally conclude it more likely represents an imaginative or distorted rendering of South America's own eastern coast, curved to fit the physical shape of the parchment being used, rather than any genuine depiction of Antarctica at all. No corroborating map, text, or archaeological evidence from antiquity has ever surfaced showing any ancient civilization possessed detailed knowledge of a landmass that remained entirely unknown to the wider world until the 19th century. It's a fitting example of a genuinely real, well-documented historical artifact, still occasionally asked to carry considerably more mysterious weight than its own actual, careful academic history really supports. Discovered in 1908 within a Minoan palace complex on the island of Crete, the Phaistos disc is a small, circular clay tablet, roughly 6 inches across, stamped on both sides with a spiral sequence of 45 distinct symbols, repeated in various combinations to form what appears to be a genuine, deliberate written message. Dating to somewhere around 1700 BCE, the disc is considerably older than the Voynich Manuscript we encountered earlier tonight, and its script remains, similarly, completely undeciphered, in this case largely because no comparable second example of the same writing system has ever been found anywhere else, leaving researchers without the kind of cross-referencing material that helped decode ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs or Mesopotamian Kyoonayyi. Numerous researchers have proposed decipherments over the past century, ranging from genuine early Minoan language to religious hymns, calendar systems, or even, according to a small number of considerably more fringe theories, a hoax created by the disc's own original excavator. Most AJEN script specialists consider the object entirely genuine, dating and firing patterns consistent with authentic Bronze Age manufacture, while still acknowledging honestly that its specific written content remains completely unread. Much like the Voynich Manuscript, the Phaistos disc offers a genuinely valuable reminder that ancient mystery doesn't always require any hoax or misunderstanding to remain unsolved. Sometimes a real, confirmed, ancient object simply hasn't yet given up its own secret, no matter how many careful researchers have patiently tried. Before we move any further through tonight's collection, it's worth pausing to appreciate how genuinely varied the actual truth behind each of these objects has turned out to be. We've met farmers cheerfully confessing to carving stones for extra income, geologists patiently tracing mineral formation rates across decades, and metallurgists discovering, to their own genuine surprise, that ancient craftsmen had quietly beaten modern nanotechnology to the punch by well over 1,000 years. No single explanation covers this entire collection. That variety itself is worth sitting with gently tonight. The past isn't one single kind of mystery, solved or unsolved by one single kind of answer. It's considerably more like this very drawer we've been working through together. Every object inside it different, and every one deserving its own patient, individual attention. There's something fitting about pausing here, roughly halfway through tonight's quiet drawer of strange objects, to say one small, simple thing. If these slow, real journeys through the ancient past are helping you drift off, a like or a quiet comment helps this little channel find its way to more tired minds out there. Nothing to think about right now, just something to remember whenever you're awake enough to. For now, let's keep going, further into the drawer at exactly the same unhurried pace. In 1961, at a construction site in Coahuila, Mexico, an object embedded in ancient rock, allegedly resembling a modern spark plug, was reportedly found by a different set of workers, closely echoing the Koso artifact's own story, though this particular case received considerably less rigorous documentation and independent follow-up investigation than its more famous California counterpart. Cases like this tend to surface periodically across the wider, out-of-place artifact genre, often clearly inspired by an earlier, more thoroughly documented example, without ever quite managing to reach the same level of careful, verifiable evidence. It's a useful pattern to notice on its own. Once a particular type of claim becomes popular and widely known, similar, considerably less well-documented copies tend to appear soon afterward, riding on the original story's already established fame. Among the more enduring categories of ancient mystery claims are so-called impossible precision stonework examples, ancient walls and blocks fitted together with joints so tight that not even a thin blade can reportedly slip between them, often cited as evidence of lost, more advanced construction technology. Careful architectural analysis of these same walls, however, typically reveals a genuinely impressive but entirely explicable ancient technique. Stones carefully shaped through patient, repeated test fitting, with builders gradually grinding and adjusting each block against its neighbors until a satisfactory fit was finally achieved. A slow, labor-intensive process rather than any mysterious cutting technology. Experimental archaeologists have successfully reproduced comparably precise stonework using only period-appropriate tools, confirming that patience and skilled repetition, rather than any lost technology, fully account for the impressive results. In 1860, a local doctor named David W. Wyrick discovered a small inscribed stone within a burial mound near Newark, Ohio, bearing what appeared to be a shortened version of the biblical 10 Commandments written in Hebrew characters, alongside a separate keystone inscribed with additional Hebrew text. Together, these objects, now known as the Newark Holy Stones, seemed to offer dramatic evidence connecting the region's ancient Hopewell earthworks, which we explored in considerable detail on another night, to an ancient Middle Eastern or biblical origin, rather than to the indigenous mound-building cultures actually responsible for constructing them. Given the era's already widespread and deeply harmful mound builder myth, the discovery arrived at a moment when many were already eager to find exactly this kind of alternative explanation. Later scholarly examination identified serious problems with the stone's supposed authenticity, including Hebrew lettering styles that appear to closely match reference material available in contemporary 19th century books, along with suspicious circumstances surrounding their discovery, including credible evidence suggesting W. Wyrick's own paid assistant may have deliberately planted the stones specifically for him to conveniently find. Most archaeologists and historians today consider the Newark Holy Stones a deliberate hoax, created specifically to support the popular but thoroughly false racial narrative that native peoples couldn't have possibly built the sophisticated earthworks found throughout the Ohio Valley. It's a sobering, important reminder that not every hoax on tonight's list was created purely for profit or mischief. Some were deliberately manufactured specifically to support a genuinely harmful historical falsehood. A similar pattern appears in the Bat Creek stone, discovered during a legitimate 1889 Smithsonian-sponsored excavation of a burial mound in Tennessee, bearing an inscription initially identified as Cherokee script, before later being reinterpreted by some researchers as ancient Hebrew, supposedly proving pre-Columbian Old World contact with Native American mound builders. Detailed analysis, published in the 1970s, found the inscription's letter forms closely matched a Hebrew alphabet illustration from a widely available 19th century reference book, complete with what appears to be a shared printing error, reproduced in the exact same place on the stone. Most apiographers now consider the Bat Creek stone likely inscribed sometime after that same reference book's publication. Another example of the same broader, harmful pattern, real indigenous achievement quietly reassigned to an imagined foreign source. Beginning in 1890, a Michigan farmer named James Scotford began discovering an eventually enormous collection of inscribed clay tablets, copper artifacts, and slate objects purportedly created by an ancient lost civilization connected to biblical figures, eventually amounting to several thousand separate objects recovered over more than 2 decades. Despite initial support from some local religious communities eager to embrace the artifact's biblical connections, careful scholarly examination found the object's iconography copied directly, and often quite clumsily, from a widely available illustrated Bible published in the 1880 alongside metallurgical evidence entirely inconsistent with genuine ancient manufacture. The so-called Michigan relics are now universally considered an elaborate, sustained hoax, one of the largest deliberate archaeological fabrications in American history, driven by the same underlying instinct we've now seen several times tonight: a genuine hunger for evidence connecting ancient American monuments to somewhere and someone other than the indigenous peoples who actually built them. It's worth pausing to name clearly what connects the Newark Holy Stones, the Bat Creek Stone, and the Michigan relics, since it's considerably more serious than simple mischief or profit motive. Each of these hoaxes emerged during a period when many 19th century Americans were actively looking for reasons to believe indigenous peoples couldn't have built the sophisticated earthworks and mounds scattered across the country, a belief that conveniently supported the era's broader project of displacing native nations from their own ancestral land. Recognizing this pattern doesn't diminish how genuinely clever some of these forgeries actually were. It simply means part of our job tonight, alongside sorting hoax from natural formation from honest mystery, is also being honest about why certain hoaxes found such an eager, receptive audience in the first place. In 1869, workers digging a well on a farm near Cardiff, New York, uncovered what appeared to be a fossilized stone giant, over 10 feet tall, immediately drawing enormous crowds willing to pay for a glimpse of what many believed might be genuine physical evidence of the biblical giants described in the book of Genesis. The Cardiff giant, as it quickly became known, was, in reality, an elaborate hoax commissioned by a tobacconist named George Hull, who had a large block of gypsum carved into human form, artificially aged with acid and needles to simulate weathered pores, and secretly buried on his cousin's property, specifically to be discovered later. Even after the hoax was fully exposed, including Hull's own eventual confession, the giant remained a popular traveling attraction for years afterward, genuinely delighting audiences who, by that point, seemed to enjoy the spectacle almost as much whether or not it was actually real. In 1912, amateur archaeologist Charles Dawson announced the discovery of skull fragments near Piltdown, England, appearing to represent a genuine missing evolutionary link between apes and modern humans, complete with a distinctly human-looking cranium paired with a distinctly ape-like jawbone. Piltdown Man was accepted by a considerable portion of the British scientific establishment for over 4 decades, shaping serious academic discussions of human evolution throughout that entire period. It wasn't until 1953 that improved dating and chemical analysis techniques definitively exposed the fossils as an elaborate hoax, the jawbone actually belonging to an orangutan deliberately filed down and chemically stained to convincingly match the genuinely ancient human skull fragments it had been carefully paired with. The Piltdown Man hoax stands as one of science's most genuinely instructive cautionary tales, not because scientists are uniquely gullible, but because it demonstrates how even careful, credentialed experts can be misled when a discovery happens to confirm exactly what they were already eager, for entirely understandable reasons, to believe. British scientists at the time were genuinely hoping to find homegrown fossil evidence for human evolution to rival recent, celebrated discoveries made elsewhere in Europe. And Piltdown Man arrived at precisely the right moment to satisfy that very real, very human desire. It took over 40 years and considerably improved scientific technique for the truth to finally patiently catch up with a story everyone had simply wanted, a little too eagerly, to be true, held today in a private collection. The Fuente Magna bowl is a ceramic vessel reportedly found near Lake Titicaca in Bolivia, bearing an inscription some researchers have claimed represents ancient Sumerian Kyoonayyi form, potentially suggesting remarkable, otherwise entirely undocumented contact between ancient Mesopotamia and pre-Columbian South America. Specialists in genuine ancient Near Eastern script have generally found the inscription's actual characters to be inconsistent and poorly formed compared to authentic Kyoonayyi form, more closely resembling an amateur attempt at replicating the script's general visual style than a message actually composed by a fluent, trained ancient scribe. Combined with the object's murky, poorly documented discovery history, most archaeologists consider the bowl a likely modern forgery, created specifically to support exactly the kind of dramatic ancient contact claim that tends to attract considerable public and media attention. Along the banks of the Taunton River in Massachusetts sits Dwighton Rock, a large boulder covered in petroglyphs that has been variously and quite dramatically claimed over the centuries as evidence of ancient Phoenician sailors, medieval Norse explorers, early Portuguese contact, or even a lost tribe of Israel. Each new theory reflecting whatever particular historical fascination happened to be popular at the time. Careful, modern archaeological analysis instead identifies the markings as genuine indigenous petroglyphs, most likely created by ancestors of the Wampanoag people who have lived in this same region for many centuries. It's a particularly clear example of a pattern we've now encountered several times tonight. A genuine indigenous artifact, its actual origin hiding in plain sight the entire time, repeatedly reassigned to whichever distant foreign visitor a given era's audience happened to find most romantically appealing. Kept today in Turin, Italy, the Shroud of Turin is a linen cloth bearing the faint, ghostly image of a man's body, long venerated by many as the actual burial shroud of Jesus Christ, and one of Christianity's most closely studied religious relics. In 1988, 3 independent laboratories conducted radiocarbon dating on small samples taken from the cloth, each one returning a consistent result, placing its origin sometime between 1260 and 1390 CE, considerably later than the era in question, though the sampling methodology has remained a genuine subject of ongoing, good faith scientific debate ever since. Regardless of where any individual chooses to land on its ultimate authenticity, the shroud remains one of the most intensively, carefully studied textiles in the entire world. Its faint image, still not fully, definitively explained by any single proposed method of creation, whether medieval artistry or something else still genuinely under discussion. Sometimes an object's mystery isn't really about the artifact itself at all, but about a story built entirely without one. The emerald tablet, supposedly containing ancient alchemical wisdom directly attributed to the legendary figure Hermes Trismegistus, has been referenced and quoted throughout medieval and early modern alchemical texts for well over 1,000 years. No physical emerald tablet, however, has ever actually been found, examined, or verified by anyone, and its earliest known textual source appears in Arabic manuscripts from around the 8th or 9th century CE, considerably later than its supposed ancient Egyptian origin would require. It stands, much like the Dropa stones we encountered earlier tonight, as a genuinely instructive category all its own, a legend built almost entirely from repeated retelling, with no actual object ever required to keep the story itself patiently alive. On a temple wall at Abydos, Egypt, a section of carved hieroglyphic relief has become genuinely famous online for its uncanny resemblance to modern vehicles, with certain overlapping symbols appearing to form the unmistakable silhouette of a helicopter. Alongside shapes some viewers have compared to a submarine or airplane, Egyptologists studying the actual relief in detail have identified a straightforward, well-documented explanation. The carving is a genuine palimpsest, meaning later pharaohs had the original inscription plastered over and recarved with their own updated royal titles, a common practice throughout ancient Egyptian temple construction. Over many centuries, the plaster filling gradually eroded away, allowing the original and the later carving to show through simultaneously, their overlapping outlines accidentally combining into shapes that happen to resemble entirely unrelated modern machinery. The Abydos relief offers a particularly clean example of pareidolia working in combination with a genuine, well-understood historical process. since we can trace exactly how the accidental helicopter shape actually formed, one pharaoh's carved title overlapping imperfectly with an earlier ruler's own inscription, centuries apart, entirely without either one having the faintest idea their separate texts would eventually overlap into something that looks so strikingly modern. It's a genuinely satisfying case to sit with precisely, because the explanation doesn't require dismissing what people are actually seeing as pure imagination. The resemblance really is there, and genuinely striking. It just isn't evidence of ancient aircraft. It's evidence of ordinary Egyptian temple renovation, and rather a lot of patient erosion, working together by pure accident along the southern coast of Peru. Archaeologists have recovered numerous skeletal remains featuring dramatically elongated, cone-shaped skulls, particularly associated with the ancient Patrakas culture, prompting some popular speculation that these individuals might represent an entirely separate, non-human lineage, perhaps even extraterrestrial in origin. The genuine, well-documented explanation is both simpler and, in its own way, considerably more culturally fascinating. Artificial cranial deformation, a deliberate practice of binding an infant's soft, still developing skull with boards or tight wrappings over an extended period, gradually reshaping its growth into a dramatically elongated form, considered a genuine mark of social status or beauty within that particular culture. Remarkably, deliberate cranial deformation wasn't unique to ancient Peru at all, but appears independently across an enormous range of otherwise unconnected cultures throughout history, including various indigenous groups across North America, several ancient European populations, including certain Hunnic and Germanic tribes, and communities in parts of Africa and the Pacific Islands as well. Modern CT scans and skeletal analysis consistently confirm these skulls are entirely human, showing the specific characteristic bone structure changes caused by gradual external pressure applied during infancy, rather than any genetic difference or non-human origin whatsoever. It's a genuinely remarkable thought to end this particular thread on completely separate human societies, with no contact between them, independently arrived at the very same unusual practice of deliberately reshaping the human head, each one in its own cultural context, considering the result something worth genuinely admiring. Recovered from an Egyptian tomb in 1898 and largely overlooked in museum storage for decades. A small carved wooden object known as the Sakaaatra bird has occasionally been promoted as evidence that ancient Egyptians possessed genuine, functional understanding of aerodynamic flight. Its shape, bearing a passing resemblance to a modern glider, complete with wings and a vertical tail fin. Aviation engineers who have carefully studied replicas note the object's wings are flat rather than curved, lacking the specific airfoil shape genuinely required for real aerodynamic lift. And its tail fin is oriented vertically in a way that would actually work against stable flight rather than assisting it. Egyptologists studying similar objects from the same era instead identify it as a stylized bird figurine, a common decorative and symbolic form throughout ancient Egyptian art, rather than any kind of genuine, functional aircraft model. Small clay figurines recovered from the ancient Mesopotamian Oobid culture, dating to roughly 4000 BCE, depict human-like bodies topped with elongated, distinctly reptilian-looking heads, occasionally cited in popular media as physical evidence of ancient reptilian or extraterrestrial visitors interacting directly with early human civilization. Archaeologists studying the wider context of Oobid religious and funerary practices instead read these figures as stylized ancestor or fertility deities, their elongated heads likely representing either an artistic convention or, once again, deliberate practices of cranial modification, similar to what we've already encountered tonight in ancient Peru. Similar stylized, non-naturalistic figurines appear throughout numerous ancient artistic traditions worldwide, generally understood as symbolic or religious representations, rather than literal, accurate portraits of the actual people or beings they were meant to represent. There's a quiet, recurring theme worth naming plainly as tonight's collection continues. A genuine, persistent cultural discomfort with the idea that ancient people, working entirely with their own skill, patience, and accumulated knowledge, could have produced something we today find sophisticated, mysterious, or strange, without needing outside help from aliens, lost civilizations, or secret advanced technology. Time and again tonight, the real, careful explanation turns out to be less about diminishing ancient achievement and more about properly recognizing it exactly as impressive as it actually was, achieved by ordinary human ingenuity rather than anything borrowed from somewhere else. It's worth sitting with how much more genuinely respectful that explanation usually turns out to be once you actually look closely at it. On Easter Island, the enormous stone MOHI statues, some weighing over 80 tons, have long presented a genuine engineering puzzle. How did the relatively small Archaeological population move these massive figures several miles from their original quarry to final ceremonial platforms scattered across the island, without wheels, metal tools, or draft animals of any kind? Popular speculation has occasionally proposed outside help or lost technology, but in 2012, researchers Terry Hunt and Carl Lipo demonstrated an elegant, genuinely well-supported alternative through careful, direct experimentation. Using ropes attached at different points around an upright replica statue, a coordinated team of just 18 people successfully walked the MOHI forward in a rocking, side-to-side motion, closely matching oral traditions describing the statues as having walked to their final locations, and matching where patterns found on the statue's actual bases as well. The MOHI walking demonstration offers a genuinely satisfying resolution precisely because it validates something local oral tradition had apparently been saying all along, that the statues walked, a detail earlier outside researchers had generally dismissed as merely poetic or symbolic language, rather than a literal, accurate description of the actual engineering method used. It's a valuable pattern to notice, one that's quietly recurred throughout tonight's entire collection. Genuine local knowledge and oral history, whether from Archaeological Nooe Islanders, Honduran communities, or Sage oral tradition we've encountered on other nights, often turns out to hold considerably more accurate, literal truth than outside observers initially give it credit for. Sometimes solving an impossible ancient mystery simply means finally properly listening to what the people closest to it had already been saying the entire time. Museums and research institutions today generally rely on several converging types of evidence before formally authenticating any ancient object, rather than any single definitive test. Provenance research traces an object's documented ownership history as far back as possible, ideally connecting it to a verified, professionally excavated context. Scientific dating methods, including radiocarbon analysis and thermoluminescence testing, establish a genuine physical age range for organic and ceramic materials. Stylistic and material analysis compares an object against securely dated comparable examples, while increasingly sophisticated imaging technology can detect telltale modern tool marks invisible to the naked eye. No single method is considered fully conclusive entirely on its own, which is exactly why so many of tonight's objects took years, sometimes decades, of patient, converging investigation before reaching anything close to a properly settled conclusion. In 1852, workers blasting rock near Dorchester, Massachusetts, reported finding a small, ornately decorated bell-shaped metal vessel embedded within solid stone. Briefly noted at the time in a scientific journal as a genuine puzzle, since the surrounding rock was believed to be extremely ancient. Unlike several other objects tonight, the Dorchester pot itself has since been lost entirely, with no surviving photograph or physical sample available for any kind of modern analysis, leaving researchers working only from a brief, second-hand 19th century written description. Its ornate style, as described, closely resembles metalwork associated with considerably more recent craftsmanship, and most historians suspect it was simply a discarded decorative object that ended up embedded in blasted rock debris through entirely mundane means, rather than any object requiring an ancient origin at all. If there's one genuinely practical habit of mind worth carrying forward from tonight's entire collection, it's a simple set of honest questions worth quietly asking whenever a new, impossible ancient artifact claim happens to cross your path. Where exactly is the object now? And can it actually be independently examined? Who first reported the discovery? And were they professionally trained? Or did they have some other, less scientific motive for the story to be true? Has anyone with genuine relevant expertise, geology, metallurgy, linguistics, actually studied it directly? And what did they conclude? And finally, does the claimed explanation require rewriting an enormous amount of otherwise well-established history? Or does it simply require one considerably more mundane and usually far better supported alternative? Tonight's entire collection suggests that last, quieter question is very often the one that ends up mattering most. Scattered across Costa Rica's Diquís Delta region are hundreds of remarkably precise stone spheres, some measuring up to 8 feet across and weighing several tons, carved by ancient artisans sometime between roughly 600 and 1000 CE with a level of geometric accuracy that remains genuinely impressive even by careful modern measurement. Their exact original purpose remains a genuinely open question, with leading theories proposing they marked pathways or plazas of social and political importance, represented celestial bodies within a broader cosmological display, or simply demonstrated the considerable wealth and stoneworking skill of the specific community responsible for commissioning them. Formally recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2014, the spheres are now understood as entirely genuine, carefully documented ancient artifacts. Their true, deliberate craftsmanship never seriously questioned, even as their specific intended meaning remains an honest, ongoing area of genuine archaeological research. Unfortunately, many of Costa Rica's stone spheres were significantly disturbed during the 20th century, when banana plantation workers, unaware of their genuine archaeological value, moved numerous spheres from their original locations, and in several documented cases, actually cut some open using dynamite in a mistaken search for hidden gold treasure supposedly concealed inside. This considerable, irreversible loss of original context has made determining the sphere's precise original arrangement and purpose genuinely more difficult than it might otherwise have been. A sobering reminder that a mystery can sometimes be made permanently harder to solve, not through any fault of the ancient builders, but through simple, well-intentioned modern carelessness arriving centuries later. In 1965, Yale University announced the existence of the Vinland map, a medieval-style parchment depicting a landmass labeled Vinlanda, seemingly confirming detailed Norse knowledge of North America considerably earlier and in far more geographic detail than any other surviving historical record. The map generated enormous scholarly excitement, promising direct documentary proof of pre-Columbian European awareness of the Americas. In 2021, following decades of careful, ongoing chemical analysis, Yale's own research team definitively confirmed the map's ink contains a titanium-based pigment called anatase in a specific crystalline form that wasn't commercially manufactured anywhere until the 1920, conclusively proving the document is a 20th century forgery rather than any genuine medieval artifact at all. The Vinland map case offers a valuable final lesson in exactly how modern chemistry can eventually settle even the most prestigious, widely publicized historical claims, regardless of how many respected institutions initially found it convincing. Yale itself, to its genuine credit, conducted and openly published the very research that ultimately debunked its own celebrated acquisition, a real demonstration of institutional honesty, prioritizing accurate truth over any embarrassment at having been mistaken decades earlier. It's a fitting thought to carry forward from tonight's entire collection. Genuine scientific integrity sometimes means being willing to patiently investigate, and if necessary, publicly correct even your own most celebrated and cherished discoveries. It's worth noting, immediately after the Vinland map's exposure as a forgery, that genuine, thoroughly confirmed archaeological evidence for pre-Columbian Norse presence in North America does actually exist, discovered entirely independently through legitimate excavation. In the early 1960s, Norwegian explorers Helge and Anne Stein Ingstad located and excavated a genuine Norse settlement at Lance aux Meadows in Newfoundland, uncovering real sod-walled buildings, iron rivets, and a bronze cloak pin consistent with authentic 11th century Norse craftsmanship. Radiocarbon dating and tree ring analysis have since confirmed the site's genuine age, and it remains recognized today as the only confirmed Norse settlement site anywhere in North America. The lesson here isn't that every dramatic claim about ancient transatlantic contact is automatically false. It's that the genuine version, when it actually exists, tends to arrive through patient, verifiable excavation rather than a single, conveniently discovered document. It's worth asking, gently, why stories like tonight's entire collection hold such a genuine, lasting appeal in the first place, well beyond simple curiosity about the past. There's something quietly comforting about the idea that the world still contains real, unsolved puzzles, that not everything has already been neatly catalogued, explained, and filed away by confident experts. That instinct isn't foolish at all. It's the same basic curiosity that drives all genuine scientific inquiry, the same patient wondering that eventually led researchers to properly understand the Antikythera mechanism, or to finally identify the real nanoparticles hiding inside the Lycaeu Argus cups, ancient glass. The healthiest version of that same curiosity simply stays patient enough to follow the actual evidence all the way to wherever it genuinely leads, rather than stopping comfortably at whichever answer happens to feel the most exciting along the way. Looking back across everything in tonight's collection, hoaxes born from harmful racial mythology, natural formations mistaken for engineering, genuine ancient nanotechnology hiding in plain sight, and a small handful of honest mysteries that remain, to this day, genuinely unsolved. One thread runs quietly through nearly every single object, each one, in its own way, was a real response to a real, patient question. Someone eventually took the time to properly ask, why does this rock look wrong? Why does this jar contain metal? Why won't this script translate? The objects themselves turned out to be considerably less mysterious, on the whole, than the actual human effort required to finally, carefully understand them. Perhaps the most valuable thing to take from an entire evening spent wandering through misidentified hammers, confessed forgeries, and one genuinely unread medieval manuscript is simply this: the real ancient and not so ancient world was already remarkable enough, entirely on its own terms, without needing any embellishment at all. Roman glassmakers really were quietly working with nanoparticles. Ancient Indian metallurgists really did solve a corrosion problem modern engineers still study today. Our Rehpa and Ooe Islanders really did figure out how to walk 80-ton statues across an island using nothing but rope and careful coordination. None of that needed exaggeration to be worth our genuine, patient attention. It only ever needed someone curious enough to look closely and honest enough to follow wherever that closer look actually led. In 2016, archaeologists excavating the ruins of Katsuarien Castle on Okinawa, Japan, recovered 4 small bronze coins minted during the Roman Empire, dating to somewhere between the 3rd and 4th centuries CE. An ocean and a continent away from anywhere Roman currency would normally be expected to surface. Rather than suggesting direct Roman contact with Japan, researchers instead point to the coins as genuine, tangible evidence of just how far a single valuable object could travel along the patient, interconnected chain of ancient and medieval trade routes linking Europe, the Middle East, and East Asia, passed gradually from hand to hand over considerable time and distance, much like the Norse penny we encountered earlier tonight in distant Maine. It's a small, genuinely delightful reminder that the ancient and medieval world, for all its considerable distances and dangers, was already considerably more connected than we sometimes give it credit for. In Westford, Massachusetts, a set of scratches on an exposed boulder have been variously interpreted since the 1950 as a genuine medieval carving depicting a 14th century Scottish knight, potentially connected to a supposed pre-Columbian voyage led by Henry Sinclair, Earl of Orkney. Geologists studying the actual stone have identified many of the scratches as consistent with ordinary glacial striations, natural marks left by moving ice sheets thousands of years before any medieval knight could possibly have arrived, while acknowledging that at least some additional marks do appear to have been added deliberately, and considerably more recently by human hands. Most archaeologists remain genuinely skeptical of any connection to an actual medieval Scottish expedition, viewing the Westford Knight as a case of natural marks, later human embellishment, and enthusiastic wishful interpretation, all overlapping into one another. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls discovered in the Judean desert during the mid-20th century was one genuinely unusual entry, a scroll made not from parchment or papyrus like all the others, but from thin sheets of hammered copper, listing dozens of specific locations where substantial quantities of gold, silver, and other valuables were said to have been buried. Unlike the religious and legal texts filling every other scroll in the same collection, the copper scroll reads almost like a genuine, practical treasure map, its locations described using landmarks that have long since vanished or become impossible to precisely identify despite considerable dedicated searching over the decades since its 1952 discovery. No treasure matching the scroll's description has ever been definitively located, leaving researchers genuinely uncertain whether it describes a real historical hoard, a symbolic religious inventory, or perhaps an elaborate fiction with a purpose scholars still don't fully understand. A supposed ancient Egyptian document called the Tooli Papyrus has circulated in certain popular circles for decades, allegedly describing an unusual celestial event, sometimes interpreted as a UFO sighting, recorded during the reign of Pharaoh Thutmose III. The genuine, honest problem with the claim is straightforward and considerably more important than any debate over its actual content. No original papyrus has ever been produced, photographed, or independently examined by any Egyptologist. The entire story rests solely on a second-hand translation attributed to a single individual, with no verifiable original document ever having surfaced anywhere. Much like the Dropa stones we encountered earlier tonight, it's a case where the most important and most easily overlooked question isn't what the object supposedly says, but whether the object itself can actually be shown to exist at all. Ancient historians described a fearsome defensive weapon supposedly designed by Archaeological during the Roman siege of Syracuse in 213 BCE. A giant crane-like device nicknamed the Claw of Archaeological, said to reach out over the city's harbor walls, hook directly onto attacking Roman ships, and violently capsize them by lifting one end high into the air before suddenly releasing it. For centuries, the story was treated as likely exaggeration, an impressive but probably embellished piece of ancient military legend. In 2005, engineers at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology built and successfully tested a full-scale working reconstruction demonstrating the device could genuinely function exactly as ancient sources described, using nothing more than a counterweighted lever, a solid iron grappling hook, and a considerable amount of coordinated human muscle. The Claw of Archaeological offers a fitting final example to sit with tonight alongside the Lycaeurgus, Cup's hidden nanoparticles, and Damascus Steel's nanotubes. Sometimes a story that sounds like ancient exaggeration turns out to be genuinely, verifiably true. Once someone finally takes the trouble to actually build and properly test it, rather than simply assuming it must have been embellished. Archaeological, already well documented for his mathematical brilliance, apparently really was capable of engineering something dramatic enough to sound like pure legend centuries later. It's a comforting thought to hold alongside tonight's many debunked hoaxes and misidentified rocks. Sometimes the wildest sounding ancient story is simply, plainly, the honest truth, patiently waiting for modern engineers to finally give it a fair, careful test. It's worth acknowledging, honestly, that even the most carefully researched explanations in tonight's collection aren't necessarily beyond all future revision. Science and history both work through an ongoing, self-correcting process, and it's entirely possible that a small handful of tonight's confidently settled cases could be genuinely refined or even meaningfully revised as new analytical techniques and additional evidence continue to emerge in the years ahead. This isn't a weakness in how careful research actually works. It's the entire point. The explanations we've walked through tonight aren't presented as permanent, unquestionable final verdicts, but as our genuinely best current understanding, built carefully from the actual evidence currently available, and just as ready to be updated as any of tonight's individual objects were. Once someone finally took a sufficiently careful, patient look. If you happen to know someone who holds a genuine, sincere belief in one of tonight's more thoroughly debunked claims, it's worth remembering that the underlying curiosity driving that belief is rarely anything to be dismissive about. Most people drawn to stories like the Baghdad Battery or the Ka stones aren't uncritical or careless. They're genuinely curious about the deep past and drawn toward stories that make that past feel a little more surprising and alive. The most useful, kindest response usually isn't simply correcting someone bluntly, but sharing the genuine, careful investigation behind the real explanation instead. Since the actual truth, as we've hopefully shown tonight, is very often just as interesting, and sometimes even more so than the version it's quietly replacing. As tonight's long, quiet walk through this strange collected drawer of objects finally begins winding toward its close, it's worth remembering one more time just how much patient, careful human effort sits behind every single explanation we've covered. Geologists tracing mineral formation rates, metallurgists identifying nanoscale particle structures, linguists comparing centuries of Hebrew grammar, engineers building full-scale working replicas, simply to test whether an old story could genuinely be true. None of tonight's answers arrived quickly or easily. Each one required exactly the same quiet, unglamorous patience that seems to connect every single story we've explored together across all of these nights. A willingness to look closely, to test carefully, and to accept whatever the evidence actually, honestly turned out to say. Not every case in tonight's collection moves in the direction of debunking, and it's worth ending on one that moved the opposite way instead. The Groliai Codex, a fragmentary Maya manuscript first surfacing publicly in the 1970s, was for decades treated with genuine, widespread suspicion by many scholars who considered it a likely modern forgery given its unusual, poorly documented discovery history. Beginning in 2016, a team led by archaeologist Stephen Houston conducted detailed analysis of its pigments paper, and painting style, comparing it carefully against securely dated, authenticated Maya material. Their research confirmed the codex was, in fact, entirely genuine, one of only 4 surviving pre-Columbian Maya books left anywhere in the world. Its initial decades of scholarly suspicion, gradually and carefully overturned by exactly the same kind of patient evidence that unraveled so many other objects tonight in the opposite direction entirely. The Groliai Codex offers a genuinely important balancing note to end this particular thread of tonight's journey on. Skepticism, the same careful, patient skepticism that correctly identified the Kensington runestone and the Vinland map as forgeries, isn't a tool that only ever points toward debunking. Applied honestly and consistently, it's equally capable of eventually vindicating a genuine object that had simply, unfairly, fallen under suspicion for reasons having more to do with its confusing paper trail than its actual physical authenticity. Good, careful investigation was never really about assuming the worst or the most exciting explanation from the very beginning. It was always simply about following the actual evidence patiently, wherever it genuinely happened to lead, whichever direction that turned out to be. Looking back one final time across this entire quiet drawer of objects, it's worth noticing how rarely any single, simple label, hoax, misunderstanding, or genuine mystery tells the complete story entirely on its own. The Newark holy stones weren't just a hoax, they were a hoax specifically shaped by a harmful cultural narrative. The Klerksdorp spheres weren't just a natural formation, they were a genuinely elegant demonstration of how 3 billion years of patient mineral chemistry can still surprise us today. Even the Voynich Manuscript's honest, ongoing mystery tells us something real about the limits of what patient scholarship can currently achieve, rather than simply representing an empty gap in our knowledge. Every object, properly understood, turns out to be carrying considerably more genuine context than its simple headline label ever quite manages to capture. If there's a single thread worth carrying gently out of tonight's entire collection and into sleep, it's simply this: genuine curiosity and careful patience were never actually in competition with each other, no matter how often popular retellings might suggest otherwise. Every satisfying explanation we've wandered through tonight began with exactly the same kind of excited, genuine wonder that first made each object seem so mysterious in the first place. The only real difference between a lasting hoax and a properly solved mystery was simply whether that initial excitement was eventually followed all the way through, patiently, carefully, to wherever the actual evidence genuinely led. We've moved tonight through confessed hoaxers and careful geologists, through nanotechnology hiding quietly inside Roman glass, and a message still waiting, patiently, 6 centuries later, to be properly read. We've met forgeries built to support a harmful lie, and genuine achievements built to solve an entirely ordinary, practical problem. Every single object, whatever its actual origin turned out to be, was real enough and interesting enough to be worth this much careful, patient attention. Carved into the massive stone sarcophagus lid covering the tomb of Maya King Pakal the Great at Palenque in Mexico is an elaborate relief showing the king reclining at the center of an ornate, cross-shaped design, surrounded by intricate symbolic imagery. In 1968, author Erik von Däniken famously proposed the carving actually depicted an ancient astronaut operating some kind of rocket ship, complete with what he interpreted as control levers and an oxygen-breathing tube. Maya specialists studying the relief within its full, well-documented religious context instead identify a genuinely coherent, thoroughly understood piece of Maya cosmology. King Pakal shown falling into the mouth of the underworld at the moment of his death, resting atop the world tree that connects the underworld, the earthly realm, and the heavens above. A central, recurring theme found consistently throughout the entire rest of Maya religious art. Every individual element von Däniken interpreted as futuristic spacecraft technology corresponds directly to a specific, well-documented piece of established Maya religious symbolism found repeatedly elsewhere throughout the broader archaeological record. The stylized world tree, the two-headed serpent bar representing royal authority, and the specific descending posture consistently used elsewhere to depict deities and rulers entering the underworld. It's a particularly clear example of how a genuinely rich, sophisticated symbolic tradition can be entirely misread by someone unfamiliar with its actual, well-established visual vocabulary, mistaking careful, deliberate religious storytelling for something considerably more literal, simply because the underlying culture's own way of representing its beliefs happens to look unfamiliar to modern Western eyes. High in the Peruvian Andes, the fortress walls of Sacsayhuaman built by Inca engineers, feature massive stone blocks, some weighing well over 100 tons, fitted together with such remarkable precision that not even a thin knife blade can slip between them, all without any mortar holding the stones in place at all. Popular speculation has occasionally proposed lost technology, or even deliberately softened, moldable stone to explain this kind of precision. Careful archaeological and engineering analysis instead confirms a genuinely impressive, entirely human technique. Inca stoneworkers patiently ground and test-fitted each individual block against its neighbors, repeating the process again and again, sometimes over multiple years for a single wall, until each stone's surface matched its neighbor with genuinely remarkable, hard-won precision. Sacsayhuaman walls were also deliberately engineered with a genuine practical purpose beyond simple visual beauty. Their irregular, tightly interlocking block shapes distributing seismic force effectively during Peru's frequent earthquakes, allowing the structure to flex slightly and resettle rather than collapsing outright, a design so effective that these same walls have outlasted numerous later Spanish colonial structures built directly nearby, using considerably more conventional, uniform stone-cutting techniques. It stands as one more genuine example from tonight's collection, where the real, patient, human explanation turns out to be more impressive, not less, than any imagined shortcut. Inca engineers weren't secretly softening stone with a lost, magical technique. They were simply willing to spend however long it actually took to get the fit exactly right. Taking one final look across this whole long evening's collection, it's worth noticing how often the genuinely satisfying answer required someone from a completely different field of expertise than you might initially expect. A metallurgist explained the Baghdad Battery's likely real purpose. A code breaker's patient statistical analysis, even without a full translation, told us something genuine about the Voynich Manuscript's underlying structure. A team of mechanical engineers, rather than historians, finally proved Archimedes' claw could really work. Solving these kinds of mysteries again and again tonight required borrowing careful expertise from wherever it actually happened to live, rather than assuming any single discipline could ever fully answer a question. This genuinely varied on its own. There's a comforting kind of symmetry in ending tonight's journey here. Since we began with a single hammer, mistaken for something impossibly ancient. And we're ending with an entire drawer's worth of similarly mistaken, misunderstood, or genuinely still unread objects, each one eventually receiving exactly the same basic gift. Someone willing to look closely, patiently, and honestly for as long as it actually took. Some of tonight's objects gave up their secrets within a single afternoon of careful analysis. Others, like the Voynich Manuscript or the Roman dodecahedra, are still quietly waiting, exactly as they have for centuries, for whoever eventually turns out to be patient enough to finally understand them properly. Whatever else you carry forward from tonight's long, quiet walk through this strange collected drawer, let it be this: the real past, examined honestly and carefully, rarely needs any embellishment to remain genuinely worth our attention. A hammer in a rock, a jar with a copper tube, a bronze puzzle with no known purpose at all. Each one, properly understood, turns out to be plenty remarkable exactly as it actually is. One last small object worth a final gentle mention before we close the drawer for tonight. In 1922, workers restoring an old French cathedral found a sealed lead box within a wall cavity containing nothing more than a bundle of ordinary building receipts and a handwritten note from the original stonemasons, left specifically for whoever eventually happened to find it centuries later. It wasn't treasure, and it wasn't a mystery requiring any investigation at all. It was simply a message, patiently waiting in the dark, from one group of careful, hard-working people to another group they would never actually meet. Not every object sealed away by the past needs to be strange or unexplainable to be worth discovering. Sometimes it's simply worth finding because someone long ago wanted very much to be remembered as tonight's long, quiet walk through this collected drawer of strange objects finally comes to rest. It's worth remembering that curiosity itself, the same simple, patient curiosity that first made every single one of these objects feel so mysterious, is never really the thing that needs correcting. It's a wonderful, valuable instinct, exactly the instinct that eventually uncovered nanoparticles in ancient Roman glass and carbon nanotubes in a centuries-old blade. The only thing tonight ever asked of that curiosity was patience, a willingness to keep looking a little longer, a little more carefully, until the actual, honest answer finally, quietly emerged. If you happen to come across a new impossible artifact, claim sometime after tonight, drifting past in a video or an article promising some dramatic rewrite of everything we thought we knew. Let tonight's whole collection be a gentle, patient companion to carry along with you. Ask where the object actually is right now. Ask who has genuinely, directly examined it. Ask whether the explanation on offer requires overturning an enormous amount of otherwise careful, well-supported history, or whether a quieter, more mundane answer might fit the evidence just as well, or considerably better. More often than not, somewhere between a confessed hoaxer, a patient geologist, and an honest, ongoing scientific question, you'll likely find something close to the actual truth, waiting there exactly where it's been the entire time. And so, at the very end of this particular kind of night, we're left with a whole quiet drawer, gently closed now, full of hammers and batteries and bronze puzzles, and one still unread manuscript, each object exactly what it actually is, no more and no less, and each one, properly understood, considerably more interesting for the patient honesty required to finally, carefully understand it. Before we finally close this drawer for the night, it's worth remembering that new objects join it all the time, dug up from fresh fields, pulled from old museum storage boxes, or simply photographed for the first time by someone patient enough to finally notice something unusual. Somewhere out there, right now, another dodecahedron is likely still sitting quietly underground. Another confused geologist is patiently examining another oddly encased tool. And another careful researcher is quietly running one more test on one more object that everyone else assumed had already been fully explained. Tonight's collection was never really finished, and it never really will be. It simply pauses here, gently. For now, sleep tends to work a little like careful research does. In its own quiet way, you can't force the answer to arrive any faster than it's actually ready to, no matter how eagerly you might want it to hurry. You simply stay patient, stay comfortable, and let whatever needs to settle finally settle in its own unhurried time. Wherever you are right now, whatever the day happened to bring you, there's nothing left to solve tonight. Just this quiet drawer, gently closed, and the rest of the night, patiently, unhurriedly waiting for you. A hammer, a battery, a spark plug, a stone, a skull, a manuscript, a cup, a blade, a bowl, a coin. 10 small objects among tonight's much longer collection, each one carried by someone at some point into a moment of genuine wonder, and each one eventually carried gently back down into ordinary, honest explanation. That's not really a disappointing ending. It's simply what patient, careful curiosity actually looks like. followed all the way through to wherever it genuinely leads. Recovered in 1850 from the ruins of the ancient Assyrian city of Nimrud in modern Iraq, a small, carefully ground piece of rock crystal, slightly oval and convex on one side, has occasionally been proposed as evidence that Assyrian craftsmen possessed genuine telescope technology nearly 3,000 years ago, based partly on later astronomical texts describing unusually precise observations of distant celestial objects. Optical specialists who have examined the so-called Nimrud lens directly confirm it is indeed a genuinely and carefully ground optical lens, capable of magnifying small objects and potentially focusing sunlight, representing real, confirmed ancient skill in shaping and polishing rock crystal to a deliberate optical curve. Most researchers, however, consider it considerably more likely the lens served as a magnifying aid for fine detail work, engraving small inscriptions or working delicate jewelry, or functioned as a purely decorative inlay rather than as a component within any kind of assembled telescope, since no additional lenses, tubes, or mounting evidence supporting that more elaborate claim have ever been recovered alongside it. The Nimrud lens offers a genuinely fitting final example for tonight's collection, since it sits precisely in between so many of the categories we've carefully sorted through this evening. It isn't a hoax at all. The lens is entirely genuine, and it isn't merely a misunderstood natural formation either, since real ancient hands clearly, deliberately shaped it with real skill. It simply may be, honestly, a smaller, quieter achievement than its more dramatic ancient telescope reputation suggests. Real evidence of genuine optical skill, without necessarily requiring the more elaborate assembled instrument some enthusiasts have hoped for. Sometimes the most honest answer to give a genuinely remarkable object isn't yes, exactly as dramatic as advertised, or no, not real at all, but simply yes, genuinely impressive, just not quite in the specific way the story initially claimed. Housed today in Sweden's National Library, the KOH-Dex Gigas is the largest surviving medieval manuscript in the world, standing nearly 3 feet tall and weighing over 160 pounds. Its pages containing the complete biblical text alongside historical chronicles, and most famously, a striking full-page illustration of the devil. Medieval legend claimed the entire enormous volume was written in a single night by a monk facing execution, who supposedly struck a desperate bargain with the devil himself to complete the impossible task by dawn in exchange for his life. Careful modern handwriting analysis instead reveals the entire manuscript was, in fact, written by a single dedicated scribe. But across an estimated 20 to 30 years of sustained, patient work rather than one single supernatural evening. The KOH Dex Gigas offers a genuinely fitting companion to tonight's collection, precisely because the real human explanation manages to be almost as impressive as the supernatural legend it quietly replaces. A single monk devoting decades of his own working life to completing a single, enormous, unified manuscript entirely by hand represents a genuinely remarkable feat of sustained personal dedication, considerably more human and considerably more moving than any devil's bargain could ever quite manage to be. It's a fitting note for how so much of tonight's collection has actually unfolded, strip away the dramatic legend, and what's usually left underneath is simply patient, remarkable human effort, quietly doing something genuinely difficult for reasons entirely its own. In Newport, Rhode Island, a round stone tower has been variously claimed over the centuries as evidence of medieval Norse exploration, a structure built by the Knights Templar, or even a Portuguese lighthouse predating English colonization entirely. Careful modern analysis, including detailed mortar composition testing and tree ring dating of wood fragments embedded within its structure, instead confirms the tower was built by English colonists sometime in the mid-1600s, almost certainly serving as a windmill. Its distinctive round stone design closely matching other confirmed colonial-era windmills documented elsewhere in England during the very same period. It joins the Kensington runestone and the Vinland map as one more entry in a now familiar pattern. Genuine excitement about possible pre-Columbian European contact, patiently traced back instead to a considerably more ordinary, though still genuinely interesting, colonial explanation. Taking one truly final look across this long evening's entire collection, from a Texas hammer to a Swedish devil's Bible, the real lesson was never really about learning to distrust every strange or surprising object we might ever encounter. It was about learning to extend that same object exactly the same respect any genuine mystery deserves. Real, patient, careful attention followed all the way through to wherever the evidence actually, honestly leads, however long that particular journey happens to take. Before we finally close this particular drawer, one more small object deserves a gentle mention. In the Egyptian Museum in Cairo sits an unassuming wooden model boat, one among literally thousands of similar miniature funerary boats recovered from ancient Egyptian tombs, each one placed there to symbolically carry the deceased across the waters separating life from the afterlife. Nothing about it is mysterious at all. No hidden battery, no impossible technology, no undeciphered script. It's simply a small, carefully carved wooden boat, exactly what it appears to be, made with genuine skill by an ancient craftsman for an entirely ordinary, well-understood religious purpose. Sometimes, after an entire evening spent sorting through hoaxes and misunderstandings and honest unsolved puzzles, there's something quietly restful about an object that simply, plainly, is exactly what it looks like. That's perhaps the gentlest way to end tonight's long walk through this collection. Not every ancient object needs to be a mystery at all. Most of them, in fact, aren't. They're simply ordinary, carefully made things, tools and toys and vessels and boats, created by people going about their entirely ordinary lives, only occasionally, and usually quite by accident, ending up looking considerably stranger to us now than they ever actually were to the people who first, quite plainly, made them. There's one last thought worth sitting with before we let this drawer finally close for the night. Every object we've wandered through, whether hoax, misunderstanding, or honest mystery, was handled at some point by real hands. A farmer pulling a stone from tree roots, a diver cutting open a geode, a scribe bent patiently over a single enormous page for 30 quiet years. The objects themselves will keep sitting exactly where they are in museum cases and private collections, and in one or two cases, nowhere at all anymore. But the patient human curiosity that first picked each one up, turned it over, and asked what it actually was, that part of tonight's story never really stops. It simply moves on quietly to whatever gets picked up and turned over next. And so we come, gently, to the end of tonight's long walk through this strange, collected drawer of objects. We've moved from a hammer sealed in stone to a bronze puzzle nobody has ever solved, from confessed hoaxers and harmful old myths to nanoparticles quietly hiding inside Roman glass. We've met a monk who spent 30 patient years on a single enormous book, and a small wooden boat that never needed to be mysterious at all to still be worth our attention. Some of tonight's mysteries closed neatly, patiently explained by geologists, metallurgists, and careful code breakers willing to do the slow, unglamorous work of actually finding out. A few honestly didn't close at all, and we let them stay open, exactly as open and unresolved as the evidence genuinely allows. What ties all of it together isn't really the hoaxes, or the minerals, or even the handful of genuine, still unsolved puzzles. It's something quieter, the same simple, very old human instinct to notice something strange and to want badly enough to spend real time on it to understand what it actually is. That instinct built a scroll pretending to be a battery, and it built the patient scientific method that eventually figured out what it really was instead. It's the same instinct that carved a fake commandment into a stone to support a lie, and the same instinct, considerably more honorable, that patiently traced the carving back to a 19th century reference book to correct it. That thread runs, unbroken, from a Texas creek bed all the way to wherever you happen to be resting right now. If your mind is still gently sorting through hammers and batteries and one still unread manuscript, that's all right. There's nothing left to hold onto tonight, nothing you need to remember for later. Let your jaw loosen one more time. Let your shoulders sink further into whatever is holding you up, mattress or couch or chair, wherever tonight happens to have found you. Take one more slow breath in and let it go even more slowly than the last. The way an old, patient question finally settles once someone has taken the time to properly answer it. If you're still awake and still wanting more, there's another video like this one waiting whenever you need it. Another slow, quiet walk through the past, ready to carry you the rest of the way to sleep. But for now, there's nowhere else you need to be, and nothing else you need to do. The drawer will still be there tomorrow, gently closed, exactly as patient as everything else we've wandered through together tonight, holding its objects exactly where they've always been, waiting for whoever happens to open it next. Sleep well. I'll see you next time.